I'm not mad. I'm disappointed.
I am recording this. Fair warning. Is that really necessary?
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. Today I'm going to be reviewing the new Aster film, Eddington, which I went and saw at an early press screening. This was my most anticipated film for the month of July, and when I chose it to be the film I was planning on reviewing this week, I had made that decision ages ago, and I made that decision under the assumption that I would like the film more than I actually did. We are in the less spoilers section of this review, but we will also share some thoughts with more spoilers after this. Both of those sections are timestamped. Now, Ari Aster is a filmmaker that a lot of viewers became interested in because of his work in the horror genre, with his first two feature films, Hereditary and Midsommar. Those are definitely the films I like the most out of his four features. I only just saw Beau is Afraid recently for the first time in the lead up to the release of Eddington. I knew that Joaquin Phoenix was the lead of that film, and he was also going to be the lead of Eddington. I didn't know much about the plot of Beau is Afraid beforehand, but I was aware that the reaction had been divided, and there was a genre switch where he was no longer doing something that was more straight up horror. Having seen Beau is Afraid now, I can see why it would have that type of reaction, not only because of the genre switch, which means that the people who wanted yet another horror film were not going to get that, but also because it's a film that uses a fair bit of surrealism. Anytime you incorporate surrealism, there is always that possibility of viewers who are only accustomed to information being presented in a very literal way, having some difficulties to understand what you're doing and what you really mean with your storytelling. I don't say that to be condescending, but I look at it as more of a case of apples and oranges. Different viewers will vary in their preferences, especially when you're talking about the more casual movie-going audience that doesn't live and breathe for exploring the many corners of film as an art form. That being said, if you are watching a review of an Ari Aster film on YouTube, I'm going to make a guess that that particular principle probably doesn't apply to you. When Eddington began to start its marketing rollout, I was aware that the story was set in a small fictional town during the earlier point of lockdown during 2020, and that tensions and conflict would be building up between certain characters. Also, there was going to be a large ensemble of big-name actors. My main hope was that, even if I wasn't entirely sold on the premise, that at the very least there would be performances that would be highly enjoyable to watch. Also, you have a director with a very specific artistic style to their filmmaking that makes their various films really feel like a work of art as opposed to a product made by committee. So all of those variables added up to make this, as I already said, my most anticipated film of July. And then I saw the film.
Has the planet gone mad?
The basic premise of Eddington is that you have the sheriff of Eddington, Joaquin Phoenix, getting into an ideological standoff against the mayor of Eddington, played by Pedro Pascal. Explaining the film's issues without going into spoilers is admittedly a bit challenging. The film lacks a clear enough thesis or thematic focus. It's trying to take a lot of shots at so many people that it comes across as largely immature and uninformed in its perspective. It's like listening to a petulant tantrum about political conflicts, but then when you try to engage in that conversation that it was the one to initiate, it starts screaming at you for being too political. I wouldn't be able to tell you if I strongly agreed or disagreed with the film's rhetoric because it was so scattered and often unintelligible that the more frustrating part of the film was simply the utter chore it is to try to make sense of what it is that the film wants to say. Eddington also introduces a lot of interesting story ideas that you think will be developed further, only for them to either remain largely underdeveloped or abandoned altogether. I will elaborate a bit more on those issues though, once we can talk about spoilers. Moreover, this is not the first time this has been an issue for a film I've reviewed this year, but I did feel as though the marketing was a bit misleading. The more that years go by, the less that marketing will matter because new audiences can discover films that are well suited to their preferences. But when we talk about how we respond to art right when it's first released into the cinemas, Yes, marketing can and often does impact the viewing experience. In the case of Eddington, you are presenting us with this large ensemble of big-name performers. What is the point of doing that if we're not going to see much of them? Why are you flying Pedro Pascal, Emma Stone, and Austin Butler out to the Cannes Film Festival when they are, to varying degrees, not in Eddington all that much? The only people who really needed to be jet-setting around to promote this film were Aster and Joaquin Phoenix. Joaquin Phoenix plays the main character that you are following from start to finish. Now, some naysayers online like to complain that Pedro Pascal is in a lot of films, particularly this year, but when I browsed through this most recent batch of his, he's not in them that much. There's the other new one that's coming out quite soon, but I won't be watching that. This one, though, Eddington, he's in it just a small bit. Materialists, he is gone for a massive gap in the middle of the story. Freaky Tales, he was only in that for some of the time, but that worked much better because it's sort of an anthology story. Different chapters that focus more on this or that character, so the amount he's in it makes sense relative to that format. Also, I love Freaky Tales. I got this on physical media. All of you should definitely go watch Freaky Tales.
It's my favorite movie of all time.
Yeah, me too.
Emma Stone plays Joaquin Phoenix's wife, and they completely underused her. She's only there to be the angst for his story. Far too little space was given to the horrific material of her backstory. And Austin Butler, this is now 2 strikes against an industry where these beloved directors are casting him in their movies, only to give him a couple of minutes of screen time, but then the publicity department puts him all over the press tour. And for what? He was barely in Eddington. If you go to the bathroom in the middle of the film playing at the cinema, you might miss about 97% of Austin Butler's screen time. A lot of the tension that I thought was being built up for certain storylines went nowhere or didn't have a satisfying payoff, and it's far too disorganized in how it attempts to address political topics while simultaneously refusing to engage with those topics in a meaningful way. My poll quote is as follows. Despite this being my most anticipated film of July 2025, I was left sorely disappointed. A star-studded ensemble full of criminally underused performers, Eddington struggles to make any of its points clear under the weight of noisy call-outs that ultimately lead nowhere.
Look, Joe, 6 feet.
Now let's get into some of the spoiler feedback. Joaquin Phoenix's character, Joe, is the town sheriff, and he becomes the main source of the anti-mask, anti-lockdown rhetoric. He is a petulant child about wearing masks and doesn't want to follow the mandates that have been issued from people higher above him in the bureaucratic chain of command of how policy works. Pedro Pascal is Ted, the mayor of Eddington, who is running for re-election. And on the one hand, Ted represents the people who do wear masks and abide by those policies. However, they also play around with elements of him being representative of the performative theatrics of American politicians. It was something that I might have been interested in them developing a bit further, but Pedro really isn't in the film that much, so that's just one of multiple concepts or story ideas that they could have delved more deeply into the layers of, but ultimately didn't end up doing. When the tension between these two characters escalates further, Sheriff Joe decides that he wants to run for mayor against Ted Garcia. But their rift is not only about political, ideological differences between them. There is also resentment because Ted had briefly dated Joe's wife Louise, who is played by Emma Stone, 20 years earlier. Joe believes that Ted assaulted Louise and got her pregnant, but that's actually a lie that was made up by Louise's mother, Dawn. Dawn lives with Joe and Louise, and she is a far-right conspiracy theorist who is often spouting nonsense. Louise didn't keep the baby. She had a procedure done to get rid of the baby. Joe really wants to have a baby with Louise, but their marriage is in a really bad state, so as far as we can tell, he's far more motivated to pick these fights and lash out against Ted because he's frustrated about the state of his marriage. What you eventually learn, though, is that Louise was abused, molested when she was a child. I couldn't fully tell if they were trying to insinuate that it was her father doing it, but either way, that was the actual reason why she got pregnant when she was younger. I think her mother forced her to get rid of the baby. That was the vibe I was getting from the way they were talking in circles around this part of the convoluted plot of this film, was that it was Louise's father, who is Dawn's husband, who was harming her, got her pregnant, and thus Dawn forced her to get rid of it, and Dawn's insistence on concocting and perpetuating this narrative that it was Ted who had impregnated Louise is a facet of the family trauma and cycle of abuse. Now, that being said, this part of the story was highly underdeveloped, especially considering the severity of the subject matter. Considering how generational trauma and toxic family dynamics are a pillar of Ari Aster's storytelling thus far in his career, I really wish they had pulled back on a lot of the noisy nonsense to do with these surface level complaints about political ideological conflicts, because this is what Ari Aster has thrived at. And if he had kept a more focused narrative, I think I would have enjoyed things more than I did. As it stands, Louise is barely in this movie because she runs off after Joe publicly exposes this false narrative about Ted assaulting and impregnating Louise 20 years earlier, but then she immediately turns around and posts on Facebook that Joe lied about what Ted did and that Ted didn't actually do that. So Joe used his wife's worst trauma as a political campaign stunt to try to help him win a mayoral election. Loser behavior, and that is a nice way of describing it. Louise runs off with Vernon, that's Austin Butler's character, who is this charismatic cult leader whom Louise and her mother had been listening to online throughout the first portion of the film. If you thought I was perturbed that Ted and Louise are barely in this film, Vernon is the one that is truly a blink and you'll miss it character. Why was Austin Butler featured in the marketing for this film at all? Why was his character included in this story in the first place? What this ultimately comes down to is that there are at least 2 or 3 movies that are attempting to be stuffed into a space where one film belongs. You could have either just predominantly focused on the family turmoil of Joe and Louise and Dawn. Maybe Ted is involved slightly, but only as an outside player who isn't given that much focus in the narrative. You could have kept a sort of Hereditary-esque drama within the family home, lots of arguments, lots of peeling back the layers of the generational trauma, and you uncover the things that went on. Or you could have focused on this escalating tension between these two men who are on opposite sides of an ideological issue, but you would also expose how both of them are ultimately flawed, performative, damaged, and so on and so forth. But neither one of these 2 narrative concepts I have just mentioned were developed fully enough for my liking. Because after the whole debacle of Joe exposing his wife's personal trauma to the internet and falsely accusing Ted of what he believed was true, and Louise responding on the internet sharing what actually happened and her saying that what her husband had said was false, Joe goes to a campaign fundraising event happening at Ted's house, and they get into this really childish up and down of the volume button on a speaker system because the reason why Joe came over was there was a noise complaint. And this particular encounter culminates in Ted slapping Joe across the face twice. Hilarious. And then Joe walks out pouting and looking as though he's about to cry. Now, this entire film opens with the camera following a mentally ill, unhoused man who is just saying a lot of nonsensical ramblings. He has a bit of a recurring presence in the film, which culminates in him breaking into a local bar. Joe shows up, and he watches this man rambling to himself and drinking out of multiple bottles of alcohol. And Joe shows up there and he watches this happen for a while, and then he gets his gun out and repeatedly shoots this unhoused man. This scene happened after Ted had slapped him twice at this fundraising event. So then Joe retrieves the casings, he cleans up the evidence as best as he can, and then he disposes of the body, after which he goes to a spot that is far but not that far from Ted's house, and he uses a high-power, sniper rifle? I don't know what sort of weapon it was, but he kills Ted and Ted's teenage son. And one of the most frustrating parts about this is that when they were playing around with this escalating tension between these two men, I thought that this was going to last longer and have more of a back and forth. Maybe we were going to get some sort of Straw Dogs or Cape Fear vibe, not that those films' narratives precisely match the Joe versus Ted dynamic within Eddington, but I'm more so using them as a broad reference of the vibe, tension, conflict, and escalations between them that grow increasingly violent in the final stretch of those films. But Ted and his son are killed either a third or halfway through the film. That's what it felt like anyway, because there was so much else that went on after that. There was a whole other set of events going on with the teenage characters that, to be honest, it's just very petulant and annoying. And the TLDR was that I liked that part of the film the least out of everything else that was going on in the story. This isn't a I watched blank so you don't have to type of review where I just retell you the entire story. If you haven't seen it and you're curious, I would still say to watch the film even if I wasn't a fan of its storytelling. With a film like Eddington that is aimlessly yelling at so many people for so many reasons, their use of social media, their performative stunts of not very informed activism, their disdain for wearing masks. This list just goes on and on. It feels like some of the film's most ardent defenders are going to dismiss negative reviews of it as only happening because the reviewers disagree with the film's politics. And I can't speak for any other critics, but for me, I wish the film had had a more developed political perspective, an ideology and point of view to share with the audience. And if that had been the case, I would be able to engage with that, and maybe I would agree or disagree, but either way, we would at least have been able to engage in a discussion of its rhetoric. But the way that it addresses these issues lacks any real conviction for me to feel inspired to respond to it. It was very muddled. Despite the fact that I didn't enjoy this film, I'm not at a place of dismissing Ari Aster. I do like his other films and rate them more favorably than this one. And when I look at various filmmakers who have released multiple feature films throughout their career, it's actually very normal that my feedback is varied, where I enjoy some of their films more than the others. And maybe Ari Aster's next film will be something that I will enjoy more than this, but we will just have to wait and see.